Valentina is currently conducting her PhD in Egyptology here at the University of Birmingham with a research project focused on conceptions and beliefs related to death and bereavement at Deir Medina and Tel El Amarna. She worked at the Museo Egizio in Turin, of course in Italy, whereas now she is currently working on at the Camnes Center for Archaeological Studies based in Florence. That's also in Italy.
Thank you so much, Mente.
Okay, so welcome, and you can start your presentation when you're ready.
Okay, can you see my screen? I hope so. Yeah, so I'll start. According to modern psychology, metaphors are one of the many different languages employed by bereaved people in order to heal after a loss. Psychologists tend to consider the existence of 4 modes of expression, 4 types of language, and 3 contingent factors. All those expressions are used to explain in different ways, not only by words, the feeling of a grieving person, and they are analyzed and studied by psychology to provide a framework for better comprehending the individual's anguish and helping them cope with pain. In fact, if grief can be considered a universal state, common to humankind despite different cultures and historical periods, grieving expressions, both verbal and non-verbal, may vary depending on social habits, religious conceptions, and even individuals' personalities. Since the way in which people deal with death and bereavement is not univocal, psychologists started wondering how to comprehend each and every different facet of the healing process after a loss, and identified the various languages of grief I've mentioned before. Due to the short time, I will not get into details of every type of language, but I will focus on metaphors and their possible application on ancient Egyptian so-called funerary scenes instead. Metaphors, a figurative language to depict a phenomenon in terms of another, are used to understand and describe a personal reality, whether they are used to express something otherwise impossible to tell, or taboo subjects, such as the loss of a loved one. Basically, metaphors help bereaved people open up, better deal with the grieving process, and try to understand the phenomenon happening around them. One of the most significant and eloquent examples of a metaphor on this matter is being heartbroken. Of course, the heart of the grieving person is not actually in pieces, but the feeling is quite the same, and the bereaved person uses this figurative language, this image, to express their agony and try to make their emotions clearer to someone who is not experiencing the same pain. However, metaphors are not necessarily verbal, since they can be expressed also using specific gestures. A determined pose or movement can be considered a metaphor, a way to express a feeling otherwise undefinable. For instance, in the masterpiece of Michelangelo, La creazione di Adamo, there are plenty of iconographic metaphors. Probably the most evident one is given by the fact that Adam is depicted naked, vulnerable, almost, let's say, passive, whereas God is dressed and represented over the figure of Adam, giving him a great power. Therefore, sometimes body language can supply spoken language, and gestures become a different way to communicate, for instance, a strong emotion, an emotion that words cannot contain. Works on visual metaphors have already been carried out in Egyptology, but none of them, at least to my knowledge, with a specific focus on scenes related to bereavement and especially from the psychology point of view on languages of grief. In previous studies, in fact, visual metaphors have been addressed from a linguistic standpoint as a representation of a linguistic expression, or from a political or ideological perspective. A few studies have been focused on religious aspects instead, but without a specific reference to death and bereavement. Looking at the images strictly related to funerals and bereavement in general, mainly from Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amarna, and keeping in mind the above-mentioned psychology standpoint on metaphors, I believe it is possible to give a new reading of the scenes linked to funerary aspects found in these New Kingdom settlements. In fact, some of the gestures depicted on the tomb walls at Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amarna could be seen and possibly interpreted in the light of metaphors according to psychology's conception. What if, by looking at those traditional gestures in New Kingdom iconography from the psychology standpoint, we could have a different approach to the study of ancient Egyptian response to death and bereavement, or at least a new series of questions to be asked concerning the way in which the healing process after a loss was perceived in New Kingdom Egypt. In fact, I believe that the study of ancient Egyptian scenes related to funerary rituals and conceptions will deeply benefit from the modern psychology perception of metaphors and body language, also because I strongly support these multi- and interdisciplinary approaches, but I'm currently unaware of the kind of responses that this research project could provide. Consequently, I'm going to show you a series of case studies, which I believe are among the most descriptive, but every suggestion and advice is more than welcome. The majority of these scenes belong to Deir el-Medina. As you all know, Tel el-Amarna was founded as the cultic center of Atenism, a religion that was mainly focused on everyday life rather than afterlife. And therefore, there are very few pieces of evidence concerning funerary conceptions in Tel el-Amarna tomb iconography. One of these, which I believe to be quite critical for this research, is the decoration of the TA-26, the royal tomb of Amarna. I'm referring in particular to the scenes depicted in rooms Alpha and Gamma. It is true, Amarna art, characterized by an apparent strong, sometimes even exacerbated realism, is an art based on fixed rules as well, and strictly related to the propaganda of Akhenaten. However, even if these scenes should be considered in their historical, social, and political context, the gesture of the pharaoh who is holding tightly to Nefertiti's wrist is pivotal. Apart from the powerful emotional connotation of this pose, the scene could be also analyzed from the psychological standpoint, since this gesture can be considered an example of metaphor. This body language, in fact, expresses the endless pain of a father in front of the lifeless corpse of one of his daughters, a father who metaphorically cannot stand any longer and needs the support of someone trustworthy. The metaphor here is quite clear and probably expressed in an unconscious way, the necessity to face the healing process not by themselves because of the impossibility of sustaining the load of grief. The example picturing Akhenaten and Nefertiti is quite unique, but at the same time is not isolated either, because other scenes delivering the same message can be found in the same Amarna royal tomb and in different contexts too. Here, once more, the metaphor is the same, a graphic way to express the incapability for a bereaved person to stand and sustain that specific death. As you can clearly see from the images I'm showing, sometimes mourners are depicted while sustaining each other, as they are expressing their pain and helping support the burden carried by others at the same time. In these bereavement scenes, grief and pain are represented with a proper deformation of the body that becomes a vehicle to manifest agony and sorrow. According to modern psychology, in fact, the body is an important means of expression for handling grief. As recent studies suggest, in the bereavement process, body and mind are so strictly related that trying to relax the former during the healing process turns out to be pivotal in helping people adjust. Contracting muscle is a natural human reaction to pain and consequently grief. That is perhaps the reason why such public manifestations of sorrow are expressed with this facial and body contortion. And it is also possible that this psychological condition, this response to sorrow, is the explanation behind the representation of such group of mourners. Therefore, it is possible that those scenes depict a metaphoric expression of anguish and agony that can be spotted also in contemporary cultures. The feeling of almost fainting because of the pain, which is the amplified version of the necessity to hold someone to metaphorically be sustained and have someone to share the burden of grief with. So the scene depicted in the royal tomb of Amana. Pouring dust or dirt onto the face or over the head is another grieving mourning representation visible in tomb walls and funerary equipment, both at Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amana. It is possible that this gesture could have been used to induce tears, but also that this scene has a metaphorical connotation, which can be analyzed under the lens of modern psychology. In fact, the choice of pouring soil or dust could be seen as a symbolic expression of the fact that the bereaved person was feeling buried or under the soil or under earth as the deceased. Usually, but not always, such mourners are represented bent, close to the ground, perhaps because they have just picked up the soil they are pouring over their head. And in some cases, people are even shown in the act of collecting such dust, such as in the tomb of Nebin Ma'at, TT 219 at Deir el-Medina. Sometimes those who are pouring dirt over their heads are also depicted while crying with very visible tears on their faces. In the Chapel of Maya, TT 338, now at the Museo Egizio in Turin, mourners are shown with tears, and one of them is also represented bowed in order to pick up the grey soil easily discernible over the head of those women. However, even if women are usually more depicted than men as mourners, also male characters can be spotted on these kinds of scenes in a bereaved pose, such as, once more, in the Chapel of Maya, where Khonsu, one of the children of Maya and Tamit, is represented lamenting with his hand over his head. Khonsu is definitely not the only man represented in tears in such iconography. In fact, even if most of the times women's figures were associated with weeping and mourning, whereas men are depicted as part of the funerary rituals, but in a more static and inexpressive way, especially starting from the end of the 18th dynasty, men and women might be represented together in mourning scenes in the decoration of private tombs. For instance, in the tomb of Nebabu-Nenipuki, TT 181, which dates back to the reign of Amenhotep III, in the tomb of Huya, TA 1, Amana period, in the tomb of Neferhotep, TT 49, reign of Ai, and in the tomb of Roy, TT 255, reign of Horemheb. Here, the metaphor, if present, is less evident, but crucial nonetheless. If pouring dust on the head is a way to allegorically represent being interred as the deceased, this gesture of public mourning could also be considered a body language for intimate grief. And the metaphor used in this context becomes a really powerful means of communication, since it enables us to take a look at a facet of the bereavement, which is usually quite obscure for us, according at least to evidence pertaining to ancient Egyptians as well as many other ancient cultures. The way in which ancient Egyptians perceived death and dealt with the loss of someone loved or who was part of the community. Another typical gesture belonging to bereavement scenes, not only at the Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amana, is pulling and or splitting hair as a sign of profound mourning. The ancient Egyptian, as you all know, was one of the many cultures where the hair was a symbol of identity. As stated by Genep, in its form, color, length, and arrangement, it, meaning hair, is a characteristic distinguishing an individual as much as a group and is easily recognized. It was used to express someone's individuality. Sometimes it was also offered and placed into tombs, or according to some scholars, used as a sort of signature to certify something. The fact that some mourners deliberately decided to pull or split their own hair could be seen as a symbol of the urgency to modify or even cancel their own identity. In ancient Egypt, as in other ancient cultures, there were various typologies of hair offerings. Probably the most common one was the one strictly related to the rite of passage between childhood and adulthood. On that occasion, boys and girls offered to the god Horus their lock of youth, the very typical hairstyle employed by ancient Egyptian children during specific ceremonies. The offering of that lock, which characterized the social image of kids, was an important symbol of a change of identity. By giving their hair to Horus, children were invested with a new authority and became proper adults. The mechanism at the base of this rite of passage could have been quite similar to the one behind mourners who splitted or just pulled their hair, with a first phase of separation, cutting or splitting the hair, and another potential one of offering, documented for the ceremony of the passage between childhood and adulthood, but still quite obscure for what concerns the bereavement process. In this case, the metaphor could pertain to the abrupt change of identity, as it was a sort of new rite of passage due to the death of a member of the community. The loss of a close one would have determined an alteration on the previous social status, and therefore pulling hair could have been seen as a symbolic moment for passing from a determined previous identity to a brand new one. After these few case studies on the use of metaphors from a mere psychological standpoint in ancient Egypt, I would like to conclude that by analyzing the gestures of mourners represented in bereavement scenes, it looks that metaphors appear more visible in those scenes which possibly represents more spontaneous gestures of grief. Therefore, it is possible that looking at these scenes from the psychology point of view could really help us scholars have a new approach on how New Kingdom Egyptians perceived the bereavement process, at least at Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amana, and give a new hint to interpreting an aspect that is still not fully addressed: how ancient Egyptians dealt with death and how they managed intimate grief after the loss of a close one. Thank you very much. I would like to thank also Dr. Antonio Auricchio and Dr. Lucrezia Tomberli for their valuable help, advice, and support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valentina. Are there any questions in the present? Yes.
Hi, Valentina. Very interesting. I was curious that you're looking at a lot of very visual representations of grief. I was wondering, just out of curiosity, are there any textual references to grief that you're using as well? Or is that something that doesn't exist, or is maybe just not something you're currently looking at?
It's something that I would definitely look at, but since this is a work in progress, as the title of this symposium said, unfortunately, for the moment, I've just been focused on images, on iconography, but I will definitely need to consider texts as well. So thank you for your question, and I hope that soon we'll be able to answer to it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions in the room? Otherwise, yes, we have one over here. Give me a second.
Hello. I just have a quick question. You were talking about the act of pouring dust on the mourners pouring dust on their heads. I know you just said that you haven't taken a look at the textual evidence yet, but I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you came to that conclusion that it was sort of a literal feeling of feeling underneath the earth.
Yeah, of course. As you said, I'm just basing my assumptions on iconography, but I think there's, okay. Looking at a series of papers written by psychologists, and if you are interested in this topic, I can drop you an email with a list of papers. There are some gestures which can appear to us like quite unusual, quite weird gestures that behind the proper gesture itself had some hidden connotations, hidden meanings. They refer to this series of gestures with a specific word that in this moment I don't have in mind, but is one of the languages of grief that I've mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, to say that those metaphors help the bereaved people to somehow being able to accept what is happening to them and try to do things, stuff that somehow made themselves on the same level as the deceased, as the death person, help them to the healing process. And one of the examples that they do in those papers is given by this pouring soil, using dust as a synonym for the soil that is over the deceased, over the death person. So I'm still elaborating on it, of course, but I'm basing this assumption on the work that these psychologists have done on metaphors. I would suggest, for instance, one of the very last that is by Knowles and Ali, published in 2021. So it's very recent, and it's still probably an unexplored path for psychology as well. But I think that it is really interesting, and I hope that it could give us at least new hints, at least new questions on it. Sorry.
Thank you for that. And I think there was also some online questions.
Thank you very much. Yep, there's quite a few comments for you, Valentina, a few recommendations. I'll leave you to look at those. I'm aware of time. The first question is, any thoughts on the possibility of professional mourning? Is there any connection with Gaelic keeners or Arabian vocal mourners, for example?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's another aspect that I definitely need to look on, because I think that it is fundamental to distinguish professional mourners and people who are mourning because the deceased person is actually someone they loved. So I'm aware that I need to develop this aspect more. So thank you for this question. Unfortunately, for the moment, I'm not able to answer.
And I think we've just got time to squeeze one more in. Go on then. Arthur notes, in the tomb of Inner Cow, it appears that one of the grieving women has put the folds of her dress over her head. Is this a symbol of grieving? And Marie also notes there's the metaphor of the sackcloth of ashes used in other religious rituals.
I think that I'm having some issues. May I ask you to ask the question again?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
I'm a bit closer to the mic now.
Thank you.
In the tomb of Inner Cow,
Okay.
it appears one of the grieving women has put the folds of her dress over her head. Is this a symbol of grieving?
Yeah, probably. I'm still working on it, but I think it is.
And there's also, Maria's mentioned, there's a metaphor of sackcloth and ashes in religious rituals for seeking forgiveness. Is that something that you see in Egyptian iconography?
That's very interesting. And I thank you for this comment and those questions. I wanted to consider other cultures, both ancient and modern ones, because I think that there could be many links, many similarities or differences that could be, however, helpful to try and have a better idea of this subject. So thank you for this advice. I will go further in it.